In the previous video, we have explored consumer's attitude perspective, which basically takes you from the psychological sides of a consumer's decision-making process to the behavioral side of the consumer's decision-making process. In this video, what we are going to cover is the continuum of consumers' thought processes, which basically looks into what are the different approaches a consumer takes in order to decide on the product he finally decides to purchase. So the first step of this consumer's continuum of thought processes is the rational approach. Now, what do we mean by this rational approach? Rational approach is essentially driven by standard economic theory, where consumers assess their different options of purchases relative to their net worth. That is, they have a particular budget in mind based on which they decide whether to buy something or not, and they basically maximize their utility subject to this budget constraint. So you can see in the video that as a consumer, you are in this utility line where you are trying to maximize your budget constraint subject to the utility on this point. The second approach under this continuum of thought processes is the motivational approach. Now, this motivational approach is less than rational. This is mainly driven by the Freudian and anthropological approaches to behavioral decision making. Here, of course, consumers are not rational at all, and they have some unconscious and uncontrollable urges which drive their purchase behavior. In this approach, there are three main types of appeals which marketers mainly target. Under this motivational approaches in the consumer's continuum of decision-making process, the first one, which is usually used by marketers, is the emotional appeal. Now, what do we mean by emotional appeal? As the word stands, emotional appeal basically targets the inherent emotions which consumers feel when they are making a purchase behavior. For example, when you are going to buy a gift for your dad during the Father's Day celebrations, which is every year, you probably think about your dad and what kind of things he likes, and you feel that he has taken care of you all through your life, and so you want to buy a present which is really good. This is where the emotional appeal comes in, and as you can see in the video, it also shows another example where emotional appeal does play a big role in the purchase behavior. The second one under this motivational approaches is the sex appeal. This is where consumers are driven more by their sexual perspectives and sexual preferences, and where a purchase behavior is driven more by how consumers feel about the different aspects of more explicit sexual characteristics of the product. As you saw in the video on sex appeals, it's very evident to you that in this case, definitely the consumers will be very willing to purchase the Coke, which definitely creates in the consumer's mind a different sense of sexual orientation. The third motivational approach which you're going to talk about is fear appeal. Now, this approach is usually used by marketers when they're trying to target consumers for certain public service announcements, something like anti-smoking ads or something like an AIDS campaign where consumers are being made aware of the different problems associated with unprotected sex and so on. So as you will see in this following video, it is also going to showcase another instance where fear appeal plays a very big role. Under this motivational approaches, these three main appeals are definitely relevant, but oftentimes consumers are not necessarily completely irrational like we saw in this motivational approaches. We go to the third aspect of the continuum of consumers' decision-making process, which is called bounded rationality. This is where consumers are not necessarily completely irrational, as we saw under motivational approaches, or they are not also completely rational like in the case of the economics-based theory. This is where consumer decision-making is driven more by what we call prospect theory and the behavioral sciences. So in the next video, we will see what do we mean by prospect theory, what are the different aspects of prospect theory, and why is it important, probably the most important aspect to consider when we think about consumers' decision-making processes.